I will try to present you some main issues concerning the housing question in Greece and not in Athens, as is in the program. I mean, I focus, I frame it more generally in the Greek context and not exactly in the city of Athens. First, I will try to give you some information about the Greek housing system and in what sense its particularities. Then I will run quickly through the effects of the crisis on the housing sector, but also the social effects and the emergence of what we might call an emerging housing crisis in Greece. Then I will give you an idea of the recent changes, institutional and legal changes that have been happening in the frame of the adjustment programs and the management of the crisis, and about the emerging mobilizations and debates. These will be mainly from the Athens experience, but I think it's an issue that affects all cities. Now, Greece is placed within the Southern European model, housing model. It is a homeowner society. That's the main characteristics when we talk about Greece, that high percentages of home ownership. Very low, and these are the general characteristics of Southern European countries, very low social rental housing sector, non-existent in the case of Greece, indirect public intervention in housing, that is no direct provision of housing through construction programs, but mainly fiscal incentives, tax exemptions, controlled subsidized mortgage sector, land and construction laws. A very limited rental sector, which is mainly considered as a transitory status. High rates of second and empty housing, that is, families, households own maybe second property, either for vacation but also maybe a heritage or an investment asset. The important role of family and family networks for the provision of welfare and housing. And in this sense, the importance of family assets in welfare and social security, and construction as a key sector for the economy. Within this model, and these are the numbers, you can see from the EU Silk survey, we have the owner-occupied rate is 80%, and this refers to dwellings. When we talk about population in ownership, this will be lower. And what is interesting to see, and I will talk about it, is that there is a big percentage of outright ownership, so it's not dependent on mortgages, it's without burdens. But there is a rising percentage in the, it has been in the, of mortgage-paying owners, and this is the rented sector. And this provided for free is usually from family members, so it refers to people that live in family assets. And just a quick picture, this is the EU tenure distribution, and I noted here Germany and Greece, and I guess there will be a presentation in the next session, just to understand that there is a big difference in all the different tenure segments. With Germany, it's a different experience. Now, especially within the Southern European model, Greece has some specificities, some differences. And this is that, as Kostis presented yesterday, we don't have big private landlords. Big property is concentrated mainly in the public or the church. So the other parts of property is very small and fragmented and very widely distributed. Also, the processes of production and access to housing have been small. They have been protected from the participation of big capital, and it's been mainly through small enterprises and processes that you could say in a way are kind of decommodified, self-construction, informal housing, self-promotion, although this has changed gradually since the 80s. The role of the state was mainly a facilitator of these processes, so it had a very strategic role, and this is very much felt today, that the role of the state is changing. However, it was not through a housing policy per se. It was through this indirect intervention. And the financial sector was quite regulated until again the 80s and very much liberalized since the 90s and accelerated since the mid 90s. So this had, we could say, some, not we could say, certainly had some very positive social outcomes. Since housing functioned as a mechanism of redistribution through giving access to rents by urbanization and construction to a wide segment of the population. And actually in Greece, home ownership is quite equally distributed among income groups. And housing was a key field for the integration of early rural migration, but also of recent migration flows within the devaluated housing stock in city centers, and especially Athens. And in a way we could say that housing and family assets and property did and still is working as a shield against poverty and exclusion. However, it created, amongst other problems, until recently we mainly discussed about the urban environment problems or the problems related with the perception of the public space, etc. But also it created a clear division of insiders and outsiders, and especially as the terms of access to home ownership became more and more difficult and more dependent on lending. And there was this gap between income and prices. Those that already had assets, the insiders, were much more protected than those that were left outside, young people, migrants, poor, etc. And of course it silenced, it created a consensus that silenced a number of invisible, we could say, housing problems. I want to insist on the issue of ownership. This will be the spiral of the presentation. And by recalling things I said, there is a kind of discussion we could do and to try to understand how housing on the one hand was a main family strategy for access to housing, but also investment and additional income. And on the same time, housing production was a motor for economic growth and employment. So one might think there is a tension between profit and fulfilling basic needs. It did install a very widely accepted social consensus with the crisis. First of all, the housing sector, the spine of the economy, the construction and housing sector, which was very basic in the economy, is in steep recession. There is an excessive supply and very low demand. There is a significant increase in tax burden on real estate, and I will come back on this later. A large sold of unsold property, and especially this 200,000 is referring to production of the 5 last years, so new, and we can imagine there's a big stock of older property. There is a reduction in real estate transactions, more than 80% since 2008. A decline of private construction activity, so a total drop in investment in housing, in new housing building permits and housing starts. There is a decline in residential property prices, although it's not easy in a stagnant market environment to estimate the drop. If no transactions happen, then the price, it's a very crucial issue. And of course there is a lot of gambling and expectations on what will happen, as Kostis also mentioned yesterday. Actually, there is a negative credit expansion since the crisis, so there is a diminishing percentage of the loans. Also because people try to close their, people that could finish their interactions with the banking center, but also because banks have been very selective and the flow of money has been very much reduced. And of course the most significant sign is the non-performing housing loans, which are increasing dramatically parallel to the reduction of income and unemployment. In social terms, there is as I said, an emerging housing crisis, although there is a difficulty to describe it because we lack data and we lack analysis on what has happened the last 10 years. I think this is the case with most countries, however. We're not very conscious of we are not very knowledgeable of the changes that took place very rapidly during the last decade. And of course the situation of the crisis changes every day, the situation. Housing became, from a multiple family asset, became a burden. And keeping housing and family property is now a problem for, I think, the vast percentage of the population, because of the increase on taxation, but also the decrease of income. So there is no possibility to pay the monthly loan, there is no possibility to pay the rent. So there are also a lot of practices to reduce expenses of which we're not very, we know them, but we don't know the extent in which that happens. Return to parental home or postpone of emancipation of young people, family merges, cohabitation, lowering of housing standards and going into overcrowding into not really adequate housing, etc. And deterioration of living standards in relation to other kinds of needs, of survival needs, such as electricity, heating, etc. A lot of households cannot afford these things we take for granted. And of course, housing exclusion and deprivation in these segments of the population that already were excluded, and rising homelessness. We use the term neo-homeless to refer also to these cases that before were normal cases. They had a job, they could pay for a house, but now they are found in the street, and they are a big part of the homeless population. I think I won't go into details about numbers, but you can have a look. The expansion of lending and non-performing loans, etc. Also, the rented sector is not something we discuss still. However, even before, it concentrated a big percentage of poverty. There again, we don't know the extent of the problems created, and especially in the rented sector, problems are not only problems from the people that rent, the renters, but there are other social problems related to that from people that rented for a small additional income, like pensioners, which are again losing income because of this. So it's quite complex social relations also between the owners and renters. And what has risen very much is the housing stress, the cost of housing, and homeless. Now, how is ownership and the real estate sector framed in the adjustment policies? There is an interesting debate that started there was a publication of a survey by the European Central Bank on household wealth, and there's a whole discussion of household wealth. I'm now starting to understand its implications, but Southern European countries are portrayed as income poor but asset rich. So there are some interesting distortions in the picture where in some cases Southern European households are portrayed as much wealthier than the German ones or than Northern so of course it can be decomposed, this discourse, and it is within the studies. However, it is used both in different countries, but also in order to legitimize the direction of the policies that are implemented in Southern Europe, and I'm talking mainly about Greece now. So Greece is considered to have a very low modernization of its housing sector. That is, it's not very the financialization has not advanced. We don't have implemented yet a lot of innovative financial tools and mechanisms as presented before. So this is a problem and an opportunity, of course. We have a low professionalization. That is, we don't have a lot of big companies and big investors, big portfolios, asset portfolios, and etc. Working in the field. So again, this is a problem, but it is also an opportunity. A lot of wealth is stagnating in the mobile property of households. So there again, it's something that we have to work upon in order to revitalize the economy. So taxation of immobile property is targeted as a primary field to increase public revenues. And this is done regardless of contextual factors, and that is the dramatic income decrease, the slump in real estate market and construction sector, and the previous and today's social function of ownership. There's a lot of discussion on what are the motives and objectives behind this approach. And we followed yesterday a reasonment that shows that this is very much goes together with the privatization of public assets. But then there is a question, who would be interested in this very fragmented and diversified little stock? You've experienced it here in Athens. Who would be interested to invest in this housing market? And I think we also, although it's not clear, and I think also from the part of the policymakers is not very clear what they will produce, and especially what the social consequences will be. There is certainly a tendency to promote the concentration of property in hands of big internal landed players, but also international ones. That would, let's say, concentrate land and expect from the future market recovery, or we could see the housing market will turn from a homeowner one to a renter's one. I don't know, these are hypotheses of what could happen. Certainly we can see that financial instruments and these innovative mechanisms and tools are being promoted by the experts, of the financial market as a solution to revitalize the market, and then put big financial players into the game. And I think also related to these changes that are happening, there will be a completely different relation to land and property. We could say a new social regime related to who controls and owns land and housing. So the recent changes in the policy level is dismantling the already minimal state intervention. There is some strategic changes related with the withdrawal of support to small property and have to do with the taxation. Although this has created a lot of political and intense debates, so now at this moment taxation is being withholded, and there is a whole negotiation also within the governmental, let's say, block of how this should be put forward. Apart from taxation, also the liberalization of auctions that is to happen at the end of the year. And there is a new legal framework that is starting to introduce and enable these big investments and these new innovative tools that will modernize the economy. Just very quickly, regarding policy, and I'm on the wrong side. Regarding policy changes, what is interesting is that within this context, one of the first things that was done with the second memorandum was the abolition of the Workers' Housing Organization. I didn't talk about it, but it was a quite small but important part. The only instrument of housing policy. It was, however, very limited to a specific beneficiary group, target group of workers in the private sector, and did provide, again, only access to ownership through better terms. However, this was completely abolished, and it doesn't exist anymore since 2012. There are some attempts to start providing tools for defining homeless, and maybe drawing European money for catering with the really urgent and extreme, let's say, housing problems. So there was a definition of homeless in 2012, which we didn't have before that, although there was a small sector of NGOs that were working with homeless. There is a facilitation of evictions in the rental sector, although this does not make very much sense in the Greek context, where owners are actually trying to attract renters to stay in their home with no rent, just in exchange of the fixed, let's say, the costs of the housing. And there are various cuts, budget cuts, or abolition of social structures that catered for specific social groups, vulnerable groups like older people, mentally ill, etc., that create a pressure and problems where they were. Again, property taxation. The issue of property taxation is an issue to discuss because, yes, it was low on property before that, but because also of the different functions I mentioned. But now it really went from $500,000 to almost 3 billion in a very small period of time, in a period where incomes really are not there. There is a set of laws that are addressed to the restructuring of mortgage debt or debt towards banks. And within this is the moratorium on auctions, which ends at the end of this year, and then we have to see how the gradual liberalization of mortgages that is very much pressed for by the Troika will be implemented. So until recently, because of these specific characteristics I described, the housing issue was not in the political or public agenda, and we can say that there were no movements or claims apart from really specific sectoral or very localized claims. We didn't have, so the issue of housing was not there. However, since 2010, we see the emergence of a field of struggles and claims related to housing. And these are mainly by homeowners. As you may imagine, these are the most, until now, empowered social group. But also there is an array of issues that come to the fore. I'll very quickly go by some images. We have blockage of a housing auction and fiscal disobedience movement. This is mainly in 2011, and now people, I will talk a little bit more, are organizing because they are expecting this new wave of eviction because of the liberalization of auctions and foreclosures. There was a mobilization in 2012 because of the abolishment of the workers' housing organization, and there people started realizing it existed, because until then only those very closely related to it knew about it. So now there are groups, associations of local beneficiaries associations that still face the problems that this vacancy created. There are various calls for networking and coordination that start to talk about the right to housing. There was a discussion last year. There was a very severe and determined attack to squats in the center of Athens, and although they did not frame housing problems per se, this creates a kind of discussion about the legitimized, let's say, practices in relation to housing and actions for the homeless. However, homeownership, as I said, is the main issue. We see now an attempt to come out of, to create a network and a coordination on a broader scale in Athens, Attica, but also on a national scale. So there's various groups and collectives that were not, let's say, did not begin as housing organizations or housing movements, but are now addressing housing needs. Special taxation that was the first taxation of property that was collected through the electricity bills, and this created a very big problem, because when you couldn't pay this increased amount in your bill, you ended up with no electricity. So there was a big movement, the first one, let's say, solidarity movement, claiming no house without electricity, no house without water now, no one without a house, no house in the hands of banks and the state. Because also now the state, since it rises taxation and it has penalized with very heavy penalties non-paying, the non-payment not only of tax but also of the social insurance funds, or of electricity bills, or any kind of publicly owned social service, then it can proceed to seizures of immobile property, but also of mobile property or whatever. Against now the liberalization of auction, Spain is looked at a very close to our experience case where evictions are happening, and they're used, however, I think through the media also as a way to, you know, tell people, look what might happen to you, so okay, let's see. There was an introduction now in the claims about reopening the workers' housing organization, making it function again, and maybe also with a broader function. So there are some seeds, let's say, of a discussion about social policy, social housing policy, and housing as a right. So the main actions that they have taken are mainly demonstrations until now. There was a small attempt of fiscal disobedience movement, not small, quite big. However, it did not last much. Advocacy information by lawyers groups, so people are organizing, and especially locally they are trying to make a network, emergency network, so people will be ready to be there when auctions will happen, as we see in Spain. But we haven't experienced it yet. We are preparing. So I'm very interested in following this process of claim making. So from a society that was mainly towards the right to ownership and property, and how the right to housing will be framed within this context. And especially here in Greece, apart from staying put and staying in your house, this right is also related to the social control of land and housing, and the protection of the wide distribution of assets. So, for example, the Spanish claim that people want to stay in their homes even when they have been foreclosed by banks is not really yet discussed here. I mean, this is really a very much worse scenario than the one that we are defending now. And again, as I mentioned, the process of discussing about the role of the public in provision of housing, and whether this will lead us to discussing publicly what social policy would be in this context. And given also the wide distribution of property, which is a kind of power in the hands of people, whether we will start discussing about housing as commons, of collective forms of ownership, of putting together these assets in a way as to protect their social function and expand it beyond the family. Yes, so that's the questions went through all so we are in a turning point, and I think a deep structural change, but also maybe a transformative point that will bring new issues. So.